Well, hi there. Check out this bodacious false water cobra. His name is Shelby and he's my pal.
Clint, before we even jump into this, how are you feeling right now?
Good.
Why are you feeling so good?
Well, for one thing, we're in our brand new studio. After weeks and weeks of building and testing and building, we're here in Clint's reptile room, filming with all this cool new stuff. I got to build this bodacious new tank just for our set, though we are going to stock it with some cool stuff in the future. Life is good. Plus, I've got Shelby, my false water cobra that I love so much. I'm down to just one glove with this guy, so all is well. I'm going to tell you, it's easier for me to get excited about a lizard than it is about a snake. Lizards are such a highly diverse group of reptiles that they can be extremely different one from another. To me, most snakes are very similar. For the most part, they eat the same kinds of things, and they tend to be more fun to hold than they are to watch. And I keep some of the species that are kind of the most fun to hold and simultaneously the easiest to keep. And some of them are also exceedingly beautiful, which is like the trifecta. They just check all of those snake boxes. And then this snake happened to me. The first time that I ever went to see Emily from Snake Discovery, she suggested that on our list of 5 more of the best pet snakes that you could possibly get, we cover her false water cobras. I knew that they were a venomous snake. I didn't know exactly how venomous. And I'd only ever seen them at the zoo through glass. That was my entire experience with false water cobras before that day. And then I held her male false water cobra and I was completely hooked. The snake was beautiful, intelligent, and just absolutely incredible. The only snake I'd ever held that was even similar was an eastern indigo, and those snakes are exceedingly expensive and they spray poop from dawn until dusk. This had the same head shape as that indigo snake and the same kind of large, smooth scalation on that head, very reminiscent actually of a cobra. It had that same just obvious intelligence in its eyes. And it was also an impressively large colubrid snake. Just colossal, honestly. And I wanted it really bad. But I had a big question I still needed to answer, which was, is the false water cobra the best pet snake for me? And obviously I decided that it was. I can also say that I'm probably more obsessed with false water cobras now than I even was then. So the real question now is the false water cobra the best pet snake for you? And to help you answer this question, we're going to rate the false water cobra based on our 5 categories, which are handleability, care, hardiness, availability, and upfront costs. When it comes to handleability, we give the false water cobra a score of 3 out of 5. The reality is they can be excellent to handle, assuming they want to be handled and assuming you're willing to accept a certain amount of risk. You can see, actually little by little, I've been changing the amount of risk I'm willing to take with this snake, but I don't trust him 100% just yet, hence the glove. They actually have a really great way of warning you when they're not in the mood to be handled, and it's probably a big reason why they're called false water cobras. This is not a true cobra, but they do have a really excellent hood. So they hood up, flatten that neck out just like a cobra will do. They don't hold their head up in the same way that a cobra will, but they get that hood big and flat, and it really widens out that neck just like a cobra, and that lets you know they're not in the mood. And I can tell you, this evening, when I came here to film this video, Shelby, which is what I have named my false water cobra, was not in the mood at all. And he had his neck flattened out and he was turning himself to the side to look big, a lot like a bearded dragon will do. That's how their defense is. And then he was whipping his tail at the side of the enclosure. This is something I've only seen false water cobras and lots of lizards do. There's no other snake I know of. I'm sure there are others that do it, but I've never seen other snakes do this. And that is something that false water cobras will do. It's pretty wild. Even though these guys can be a little bit intimidating, for reasons we will continue to explain, I can tell you right now, of all the snakes I've held with Cobra in their name, this is the least frightening. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you should check out last week's video on king cobras. False water cobras, a big step in the better direction. And that said, this individual snake is on the short list of snakes that have bitten me. This is the first venomous snake from which I ever received a bite in my life. And given the sort of mixed reports about the intensity of their venom, that was an exciting event in my life. If you haven't seen that yet, we actually caught that on video right when Shelby first arrived. So it was one of the most exciting videos we'd ever filmed to that point, wasn't it, Shelb? And the reality is venom, especially with unknown intensity, just makes handling these snakes a little bit more intense. Nobody, at least to my knowledge, has ever been killed by the venom of a false water cobra, myself included. But the reports as far as the intensity of the venom vary dramatically. I've read some reports that talk about necrosis, and reports that liken the venom of the false water cobra to the venom of a timber rattlesnake, which surprised me to read. But I've read other reports that reported exactly the same symptoms that I experienced, which was just a little bit of itching. It does seem that in some cases, after repeated bites, you can develop an allergy to the venom. So, even if your initial experience with the venom wasn't severe, it's still probably something that you don't want to experience multiple times. But I can tell you the sort of itching that I got from my false water cobra bite was very similar to what I get, frankly, from like a crested gecko when I get bitten by a crested gecko. It seems like most reptile bites itch a little bit. And there are some studies that pretty much say that all squamate reptiles should be classified as being venomous, though I think they're being pretty liberal with the term. So arguably crested geckos are venomous, and this venom, in my personal experience, seemed akin to that, but apparently it can be considerably more severe, so that's definitely something to be aware of when handling these snakes, and it's the entire reason I have a glove on one hand. I have seen a lot of places that recommend handling them almost as though they were a hot snake and only ever using a hook when handling them. I would say that while I'm not that concerned about their bite, this is probably a great snake to use to learn how to handle hots before you start handling hots. This is kind of a warm snake, and probably about as warm as you want to take a bite from. So a good practice snake. Honestly, to get really envenomated, given that this is a false water cobra and not a true cobra, so it has rear fangs and not front fangs, you kind of have to let the snake chew on you a little bit to get a really good envenomation. So it's probably not something that you have to worry about tremendously. Just don't let it chew on you. I can tell you that since the day that I was bitten by this snake when he first arrived, ever since then he's been an absolute delight. He hasn't tried to bite me again, but given that today I'm not going to be able to watch him as carefully as I normally do when I'm handling him, which was the mistake that I made when I got bitten the first time, was that I was talking to you guys and not watching the snake. I am going to keep this one glove on for my safety, and that'll be the hand I keep up by his head the most often. If he's going to bite me, I'd rather take it on the glove than the not glove. But he has honestly not tried to bite me again, though like I said, today he was not in a very good mood, and I've been working with him for the last hour and a half or so just to get him to this point that he was ready for a video, but now he seems just absolutely delightful. Honestly, I'm not as worried about bites when handling him as I am when getting him out of his enclosure, just because their feeding response is powerful. Honestly, I don't think I've ever seen a snake with a feeding response like this. They will just absolutely launch themselves at food and thrash about everywhere. It's incredible how much they like food. And so you've got to be aware of that whenever you go into the enclosure, that you've got to make sure that they don't think they're being fed, because man, can they attack hard and fast. The biggest problem I've actually probably had handling him ever since that first day is just the musking. They don't do it often, but if he's not in the mood to be handled, he'll musk you a little bit. I don't notice it being anywhere near as pungent as, say, a gardener snake or something like that, but you can detect it, and it's something to be aware of. Overall, though, I mean, this is one of the most rewarding snakes I've ever handled. You know, like the indigo snake and other cribos, I mean, they're really fun to interact with. You can tell how visual they are and how just intelligent they are when they're exploring, and yet they're a lot less likely to spray you with huge amounts of liquid feces than our cribos. That's a feather in their cap. I would say the only other colubrid snake that I've ever handled personally that would come close other than the cribos would be like a great big bull snake. They're pretty darn good. This is even better. And definitely a lot more relaxing than handling Lilith. So there's always that. I'd like to pause for just a moment to say thank you to our patrons at Patreon for all that they do and have done to actually help us create this incredible new set that we have. This tank over here was entirely bought using Patreon funds, and we're really excited about it. In fact, what should we put in there? It's got a huge water feature and a waterfall, and it's a poldarium, so it's got space for fish underneath, but we need something that won't drown in there or be bothered by high humidity levels. So tell us what you think we should put in there. When it comes to care, we give the false water cobra a score of 3 out of 5. This is a giant colubrid snake. I waited so long to film this video because I wanted to let Shelby get some size on him, but he's still just a baby. These guys can get over 10 pounds, 7, even 8 feet long. It is a huge colubrid snake, rivaled really only by the indigo snakes and you know, maybe a handful of others. This is a giant among colubrid snakes, and that's awesome, but a giant colubrid snake is going to be harder to care for than a tiny colubrid snake. They're also a very active snake, so in addition to being huge, it's a huge active snake. This mostly just means that they need a really big enclosure for a snake. Colossal, honestly, for a snake. And for a snake, they're gonna put down some serious food, because these guys like to eat and they're active. They love food. I talked to you before about how powerful their feeding response is. On top of that, I've never seen a snake swallow food so quickly. If you look away for just a moment after these guys attack their food, it might be gone. It's just like nom 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 nom, and they just swallow it down. Amazing. And they eat just about anything with a backbone. They love rodents, they love birds like chicks, you can buy frozen chicks. Fish, they love fish. They love frogs, though I love frogs too much to feed them to anything. So I don't offer Shelby here any frogs, but he loves all that other stuff. They're just eating machines. And because they eat so much, it also means that they poop more than most snakes. Again, not like a cribo, but more than most of your snakes that poop maybe once a week, maybe every 2 weeks, or you know, if it's a blood python, almost never. These guys poop frequently, and so more cleaning, more care. Honestly, care for these guys is almost like a hybrid between taking care of other similarly sized snakes and maybe a fairly good sized lizard. So that's not ideal, but they also make up for it by being awesome in the same ways that lizards are awesome and snakes are awesome. So you get the best and the worst of both worlds. Bioactive is definitely a good way to go with these guys. It's gonna reduce the total amount of cleanup that you have to do, and this could end up being just a colossal bioactive enclosure, which is pretty neat. They also need access to large amounts of water. Doesn't necessarily have to be like a pond or a water feature, but a really big water bowl, because these guys hang out in marshes and wet areas all the time. And they do like to fish, so something kind of fun about them. They're gonna need a substrate that can handle having quite a bit of water in it, because it's gonna get soaked from time to time, and also some substantial messes. So pick a good substrate. They're gonna need hides, probably multiple hides in the enclosure in damp areas and dry areas, warm areas and cool areas. Also, provide a good source of heat. And these guys, like a lizard, are more open to basking out in the light than are most snakes. So actually providing them with a heat lamp is a good way to provide heat. You can also use a radiant heat panel or a heat mat like with other snakes, but lamps actually work really well for false water cobras, which is pretty neat. And they also seem to benefit from UV lighting in their enclosure, which, you know, is kind of a bummer, because that's one of the benefits of snakes, is a lot of times they don't need that as much. The reality is probably most of them would benefit from some exposure to UV. These guys especially, because they are so much like a lizard. They're so active and they're diurnal. They're going to be out in the light in their wild environment, and so simulating that in captivity is great for these. I told you this was a lizard snake. When it comes to hardiness, we give the false water cobra a score of 5 out of 5. Honestly, if you give these guys proper temperatures, humidity, food, and water, I mean, they're just gonna thrive for you. They're gonna do great, and they're gonna grow like weeds. When it comes to availability, we give the false water cobra a score of 2 out of 5. This is actually where they start to lose some points, because in a lot of ways they're really great. They're pretty darn hard to find. I became obsessed with false water cobras, sort of like I did with jeweled lacerdas, and both of those animals were fairly difficult for me to track down, actually. They're definitely not going to be in most pet stores. I've very rarely seen them at expos. They might actually be at expos more than I realize, because they look very different as juveniles. They don't have this beautiful mask, and their pattern's very different, and it would be very easy to overlook a juvenile false water cobra at an expo. So maybe they're there, but I have very rarely seen them actually at an expo. Even online, they're kind of difficult to find, especially out of season. The reality is these guys are very popular, and for good reason, and so most of the breeders do sell out, and so when they're off season, they just don't have them. Usually you're gonna need to get on some sort of a wait list. I got mine from Kyle Wilson out in Kansas. I found him on Facebook through some of the false water cobra groups. I knew I wanted a false water cobra, and so, you know, I joined some of these groups and started asking around, and they all recommended Kyle Wilson. And I imagine that he's gonna be so overwhelmed by requests from you guys that he's gonna send me a female false water cobra. This is a way of saying thank you. So thank you, Kyle. I love this guy, and I can't wait to get her. Right? And the reality is, even though I worked so hard to find this breeder and I joined all these groups, I still had to wait until he had babies available. So I knew he had eggs, and as soon as they hatched, I picked out Shelby here, and he sent him, and he's been spectacular. When it comes to upfront costs, we give the false water cobra a score of 3 out of 5. This is a pretty expensive colubrid snake. It's definitely going to cost you a few $100s to get one. It will also need, at least eventually, a huge enclosure and probably some smaller enclosures along the way, so you might have to buy multiple enclosures for this one, or buy one enormous enclosure and find ways to partition it off so that the snake doesn't get lost in the giant enclosure at the beginning. You're going to need some bigger water bowls, because these snakes like to swim and soak. You're going to need a number of hides, and you're going to need a heat source. We mentioned this before. Lamps with bulbs work really well. Also radiant heat panels or under tank heaters. These can all work. Just make sure you use a thermostat. You're going to need a substrate that can hold humidity and deal with some messes. And you're going to want isopods and springtails. At least I would definitely recommend this with a false water cobra, so that you don't have to be cleaning up as many messes all the time. A cleanup crew can really help you, at least with the spot cleaning that you missed, that you didn't notice. And frozen feeders, have some on hand, because these guys like to eat. We'll have links to all these things down in the description. And as a result of all of these things, we give the false water cobra an overall score of 3.2 out of 5. The reality is I just adore these snakes. But they are venomous, and they are, potentially kind of a handful. Hognose snakes We've talked about them before and I adore them. They are so mildly venomous that it's almost just like a side note. Oh, by the way, technically venomous. And like I said, you can make a case for crested geckos being venomous. But when it comes to snakes where the venom is actually something about which you should be concerned, there probably won't be a snake I will recommend more highly than the false water cobra. I freaking love this snake. Yeah, I said it. In fact, this is one of my favorite snakes in the world, period. It's on my short list of if I could only keep one species. It might be false water cobras. They're spectacular. But I am going to tell you about a couple of other snakes right now that might fill this false water cobra shaped hole in your heart if that venom is a deal breaker for you. First would be bull snakes. They've got some serious size and they're not going to break the bank. Second would be indigo snakes, if you have more money than you know what to do with and you don't mind a little spray feces from time to time. But if this level of venom is not an issue for you, and if what you want is a brilliant, giant, beautiful colubrid snake that many people will think is a cobra, even after you've explained to them that this is a false water cobra, then the false water cobra might just be the perfect pet snake for you. As always, like and subscribe, and we hope to see you real soon. And I love this dude, but not as much as I love the sound of peeing. Yeah, you're a good snake.
Cool. Let's go.
Yay! First video in the new studio. Hey, you know, this is our first ever video filmed in our new studio. There's probably some imperfections, so if there are, we apologize in advance. We'll figure things out. You know, we're doing our best with audio with a very new situation here at Clint's Reptile Room, because it's basically a giant cavernous place, which we hope you'll come visit soon. And we're just experimenting with a whole lot of new things. So if you see things that you don't like, let us know as nicely as you can, and we'll try to make improvements as quickly as we can. But we sure are excited about this new place. Did you see my snake from Ramen Reptiles?